Story 1. The 17-Mile Stretch. A horror novella. Elias Vance was a man who trusted steel and diesel, not superstition and ghosts. For 20 years, his life had been a series of lines drawn on maps and rubber burned on asphalt, his world defined by the reliable rhythm of the road. He drove a Kenworth W900, a massive chrome and red beast he affectionately called the Beast of Burden, and his philosophy was simple: if it wasn't measurable, it wasn't real. This unshakable skepticism was why, on a humid Tuesday night in late August, he decided to take Route 37. Everyone in the trucking world knew about Route 37. It was an unofficial, unmaintained, two-lane ribbon of asphalt that sliced through the heart of the desolate high desert plateau between Flagstaff and the Nevada line. It saved 6 hours, but the price, according to the grizzled veterans at every greasy spoon truck stop, was too high. They called the infamous middle section the Whispering Mile. Bad luck, Elias, old man Fitz had warned, swirling the tepid coffee in his foam cup. She don't like fast drivers, and she don't like doubters. She keeps what she takes. Elias had just grunted, paid his bill, and walked out. Doubt was his fuel, and 6 hours was a full night's sleep lost or gained. He had a delivery of time-sensitive medical equipment to Reno, and the main interstate was clogged with a multi-vehicle pileup. Route 37 was clear. The initial 100 miles were unremarkable. The desert night was crisp and cold, the sky a dizzying canvas of stars unpolluted by city lights. Elias settled into the familiar drone of the engine, the glow of the dash lights, and the company of a late-night talk radio host discussing conspiracy theories. It was just after 2 a.m. when he hit the territory marked ominously on his digital maps as low service area. The highway narrowed instantly, the asphalt changing texture from smooth blacktop to cracked, grayish concrete, a relic from a prior generation. The roadside markers, usually reflective posts, here were low, crumbling stone cairns. Elias felt the change first in the sound. The talk radio, which had been perfectly clear, erupted into a shriek of static so sudden and violent it made him flinch. He flicked the radio off, but the silence that replaced it was heavy, suffocating. It was a silence deeper than the desert, a silence that felt intentional. He looked in his side mirror, expecting to see his trailer trailing faithfully behind him, but for a split second, the reflection was wrong. Instead of the massive red Kenworth, he saw a black, squat sedan from the 1950s, its chrome glinting under the pale moonlight, pressing impossibly close to his bumper. Elias slammed on the brakes. A microsecond, instinctual reaction. Screech. The air brakes locked the 20-ton rig for a moment before he released them, his heart hammering. He glanced back. Nothing. Only the faint red running lights of his own trailer stretching out behind him, and the empty, dark desert beyond. He rubbed his eyes, rationalizing it as fatigue. Too much coffee. Too many hours. He checked his clock. 2:17 a.m. He was entering the mile. The Whispering Mile was not literally a mile. It was a 17-mile stretch of the oldest, most neglected road, winding through sharp canyons and past precipitous drops. The guardrails here were rusted out or entirely missing, replaced by crude, hand-painted signs reading "Danger, no shoulder." As Elias drove deeper, the strangeness escalated beyond fatigue-induced hallucinations. The cab temperature, which had been set to a comfortable 68 degrees, plummeted. He checked the digital thermostat. It was still set correctly, but the air blasting from the vents was icy, smelling faintly of damp earth and stale perfume. He pulled his leather jacket tighter. Then came the voices. At first, he thought it was the wind whistling through the cabin scenes, but the sound was too structured. It was a soft, undulating murmur, like a crowd whispering just outside the thick glass of the driver's side window. He strained to hear, but the words were always just beyond comprehension. Sleep. Just close your eyes, Elias. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was his name. They were saying his name. He flicked on the high beams. They cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. But the light felt wrong. It didn't absorb into the asphalt. It seemed to bounce off the surface and dissipate almost instantly, creating a false sense of enclosure. He saw the first physical sign of the highway's reputation. A faded, rusting road sign lay half buried in the gravel shoulder, bent and twisted, but still legible. Accident black spot 14 fatalities since 1980. Someone had spray painted a single word beneath the text in faded white: taken. Elias sped up, wanting to outrun the sudden, crushing anxiety. The accelerator pedal felt spongy, resistant. He was flooring the gas, the diesel engine roaring, yet his speedometer stubbornly refused to climb past 45 miles per hour. It was as if the road itself was sucking the kinetic energy from his tires. He glanced at his GPS tablet. The little blue arrow that represented his truck wasn't moving. It was juddering back and forth over the same 10-foot section of road, endlessly. The highway was holding him still. Elias fought the growing dread by focusing on the mechanics. It's the sensors. Road conditions messing with the traction control. Bad signal scramble. But the cold air felt heavier now, and the whispers had coalesced into distinct, agonizing sounds. A woman weeping, a man cursing, the metallic groan of colliding steel. He took a sharp bend, the truck protesting slightly under the strain, and there she was. Standing perfectly still on the narrow shoulder, illuminated by the struggling high beams, was a girl. She couldn't have been older than 20. She wore a pale blue, knee-length dress and white gloves, clothes that looked like they were from a museum display of post-war Americana. She had one small, cracked suitcase at her feet, and she was staring directly at him, her face unnaturally pale in the truck's glow. A hitchhiker. Here, in the middle of nowhere, at 2:30 a.m., dressed like she was going to a Sunday picnic in 1957. Elias felt a primal urge to ignore her and drive past, but the trucking code, ingrained deep in his bones, screamed, "You don't leave people stranded." He downshifted, the air brakes hissing a weary protest, and began to pull over. As he slowed, the girl didn't move her feet, but her head tracked his movement, her pale eyes never leaving his. He dropped his speed to 10 miles an hour, his window slightly cracked. "Need a lift?" Elias called out, his voice hoarse. The girl didn't answer. Her expression was one of profound, terrifying sadness. She raised one gloved hand and pointed a long, pale finger. She wasn't pointing down the road. She was pointing at a spot just behind his driver's side rear axle. Confused, Elias finally brought the Kenworth to a complete stop, the engine rumbling low. He put the transmission in neutral and reached for the door handle. Before his fingers could close on the latch, he saw it. Reflected in the massive, curved chrome of his fuel tank was the black, squat sedan from his earlier hallucination. It wasn't behind him. It was parked directly parallel to his truck, silent and solid, separated only by a few feet of cracked asphalt. And the girl wasn't standing on the shoulder. She was seated in the driver's seat of the phantom sedan. Her skin, what he had thought was pale, was actually gray, translucent. Her dress was not pale blue. It was soaked in a dark, reddish-brown stain that covered her chest and lap. Her face, the face he had just seen looking forlornly at him from the roadside, was now contorted in a silent, elongated scream, her mouth a black void. The windows of the sedan were not glass. They were thick sheets of swirling desert dust, like viewing the world through a sandstorm, yet they clearly showed the screaming figure inside. The girl's finger was still pointing, but not at the axle. Her finger was pressing against the inside of the sedan's window, pushing through the thick, swirling dust, aimed straight at Elias's throat. Elias didn't think. He reacted. He wrenched the truck into gear, his foot slamming the accelerator to the floor. The Kenworth roared, and for a terrifying second, nothing happened. The truck remained rooted, pinned between the shoulder and the phantom sedan. The engine sound was deafening, but his wheels weren't moving. The girl in the sedan, the terrible, dead girl, began to pound on the dusty window. It made no sound, but the shockwaves of the impact were physical, vibrating through the metal chassis and into the steering wheel, shocking his palms. Panic ripped through Elias's skepticism. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was malice. He thought of the old man Fitz's warning, "She keeps what she takes." Elias pulled the air horn, a massive blast of sound designed to pierce miles of empty desert. The sound didn't travel outward. It seemed to be absorbed entirely by the air immediately surrounding the truck, only amplifying the cold, the silence, and the voices. "Join us, Elias. We've been waiting. It's warm inside the earth." He looked frantically at the sedan. The girl was gone. But the passenger seat was now occupied by a man in a greasy mechanic's jumpsuit, his head turned fully backward on a broken neck, staring at Elias with eyes that were cloudy and dead. The back seat was a jumble of twisted metal and what looked sickeningly like children's toys. The air in the cab was now below freezing. Elias's breath plumed out in white clouds. He noticed the dashboard clock. It still read 2:30 a.m. He had been stuck for over 3 minutes, yet the clock hadn't advanced. The whispering mile wasn't just slowing him, it was trapping him in time. He ripped his seatbelt off and grabbed the fire extinguisher, a small, heavy cylinder, his plan a desperate one: get out and run. But before he could open the door, a sudden, sharp, metallic shudder ran through the truck. The phantom sedan was gone. Elias pressed the accelerator again, and this time, the tires bit. The truck lurched forward with a brutal force that snapped his head back, leaving the empty, cold space where the sedan had been. He checked the GPS. The little blue arrow instantly jumped forward 17 miles, stopping at a point labeled, Route 37 exit. He had somehow traversed the entire haunted section in an instant, or perhaps the road had simply released him. But the voices hadn't stopped. They were everywhere now, inside the cab, not whispering, but roaring. "You're still here. You're still on our road." Elias looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. His face was slick with sweat and fear, his eyes wild. But it wasn't just his reflection. In the mirror, the truck was still driving through the deep canyon where he had first encountered the girl, but the road in the reflection was not asphalt. It was a churning, black river of mud, studded with wrecked vehicles and skeletal hands reaching up. He realized the mile hadn't ended. The reflection of the mile was now superimposed onto the real road ahead. He was driving on a ghost road paved over the real one. The road ahead was straight, brightened by the high beams that had suddenly regained their full, blinding power. He was driving 75 miles per hour, the engine singing properly now. He was free. Number. Not yet. The reflected ghost road showed a sharp, unsignposted turn ahead, leading directly into a massive, jagged ravine. The real road, the physical road, was dead straight, perfectly safe, leading to the clear exit sign. But the ghost road was overriding his senses. His hands, slick with cold sweat, began to turn the steering wheel sharply to the right. Elias physically fought himself, his left arm pushing against his right, trying to keep the wheel straight. The wheel was heavy, alive, fighting back with an inhuman, grinding strength. He heard the sound of screeching tires, the sound of the girl's car crash, overlaid onto his own truck. "He's tired," He's tired. Just a little turn. Elias, you can stop fighting now. It's so dark, so deep, you'll sleep forever. He saw a flash of movement in the passenger seat. The mechanic, his head still broken, was sitting next to him, his mouth opening in a wet, clicking gasp. The hand that had been pointing from the sedan earlier was now reaching for the ignition key. Elias roared, a sound of pure terror and defiance that ripped from his chest. He didn't swerve. He didn't hit the brakes. He simply jammed the accelerator harder, focusing entirely on the exit sign in the distance, a small green beacon of reality. "Get off my truck!" he screamed at the apparition. He saw the mechanic's hand touch the key. Clang! The sound of metal hitting metal. The truck shuddered violently. Elias had been so focused on the ghost road that he hadn't noticed the old, heavy, steel oil drum that had been placed squarely in the center of the lane. The Kenworth hit it, sending the drum spinning high into the air. The physical impact, the sudden shock to the chassis, was enough to break the psychic hold. The ghosts vanished. The cold lifted. The reflection in his rearview mirror cleared, showing only the empty, straight road behind him. The voices instantly stopped. The steering wheel relaxed. He blew through the exit sign at 80 miles per hour, hitting the rough surface of the exit ramp so fast that the trailer rocked alarmingly. He held the wheel steady and brought the rig to a shuddering halt in the cracked, abandoned lot of what looked like a 1970s truck stop, miles past the mile. Elias sat there, slumped over the wheel, the smell of burnt brake pads and diesel replacing the metallic, damp stench of the highway. His entire body was shaking. The dashboard clock now read 3:15 a.m. He stepped out of the cab, his boots hitting the gravel. The air was warm again, smelling of sagebrush and ozone. The sky was the same beautiful, star-dusted velvet he had seen hours ago. The mile was gone. He walked around the truck, checking the tires, the undercarriage. Everything looked fine. But when he reached the front bumper, he stopped. Where the steel oil drum had been, there was now a mangled mass of dark, rusted metal embedded in the chrome grille. It wasn't a drum. It was a section of old, broken guardrail, bent and jagged, covered in faded, reddish-brown paint. He reached out and touched it. It was ice cold to the touch, and when he pulled his hand away, a faint, sweet, cloying scent, like the stale perfume he had smelled earlier, lingered on his fingertips. He looked back toward the entrance of Route 37, now nothing more than a faint line disappearing into the blackness. He understood now. The Whispering Mile wasn't a place where accidents happened. It was a hungry entity, an eternal knot of tragedy woven into the road itself, demanding sacrifices. It manifested the wrecks and the dead to force drivers to join them. Elias pulled the twisted metal free with a grunt, throwing it into the weeds. He got back in his cab, the driver's seat feeling suddenly alien and cold. He finished his coffee, waiting until the first pale lines of pre-dawn light bleached the sky gray. He started the engine, the familiar sound now a comforting, solid reality. He drove on, making his delivery without further incident. He told his boss the delay was due to construction. He never told anyone what happened. He never drove Route 37 again. But sometimes, when he was driving late at night on a different, safer highway, he would glance in his rearview mirror. He would see nothing but the long, clear road behind him. And yet, for a moment, he could almost swear that the shadows at the edge of his peripheral vision seemed to contain a faint, pale blue flicker, and he could hear the sound of an old sedan, pressing close to his bumper, waiting. The mile had released him, but Elias knew, with a certainty colder than the desert night, that the road would be waiting if he ever came back. She was patient. She had all the time in the world. Story 2. The ghost gauged the air in the cab of the battered Ford Transit van smelled of stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Dean Hollow gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn plastic, his eyes fixed on the ribbon of asphalt ahead. He was driving Route 62, a barely maintained mountain pass slicing through the deepest folds of the Appalachians, the kind of road map applications confidently marked as a shortcut, but which seasoned travelers knew was a geographical punishment. Dean wasn't thinking about the delivery of medical supplies. He was thinking about the empty seat beside him, where his wife, Sarah, should have been, and about the ambulance siren that still screamed in the dark, silent corners of his mind. He had quit being an EMT 6 months ago, abandoning the structured chaos of saving lives for the solitary, brain-numbing routine of hauling cargo. Isolation was the only anesthetic that worked. He checked the fuel gauge. 3/4 full. Plenty of range for the remaining 100 miles to Asheville. He'd filled up an hour ago at a run-down station called The Last Chance, its only sign of life a flickering neon. Open sign and a toothless owner who had squinted suspiciously at the van's license plate. It was 1:47 a.m. The highway climbed relentlessly, walled on both sides by dense, suffocating black forest. No stars penetrated the thick canopy, and the night was an absolute void, broken only by the stuttering beam of his headlights. Then, the first impossible thing happened. Dean looked at the dashboard. The fuel gauge, which had shown 3/4 full seconds earlier, was now teetering just above the half mark. He frowned, tapping the acrylic cover. A faulty sensor. The van, old and temperamental, often had electrical quirks. He glanced at the odometer. 187,452 miles. He knew he'd been driving for a solid 20 minutes since he last checked. He focused on the road, taking a sharp left bend. Ahead, a large, distinctive boulder, split vertically down the middle by a lightning strike, sat right on the shoulder. He remembered passing that boulder minutes ago. He pressed the accelerator, determined to ignore the glitch. He passed the boulder. He drove for what felt like 5 minutes, pushing the van hard up the incline. The engine whined, the tires gripped. The road straightened, offering a brief view of a forested valley below. He looked at the odometer. 187,452 miles. It hadn't changed. He looked at the fuel gauge. Now, barely a quarter tank remained. He slammed the brakes, the van skidding slightly on the damp road. He came to a stop just before a tight curve. He was breathing heavily, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. No, 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 he muttered, shaking his head. He checked his clock. 2:05 a.m. 18 minutes had passed. He checked the odometer again. 187,452 miles. He looked ahead. Beyond the curve, illuminated by his high beams, sat the enormous, lightning-split boulder, exactly where he had seen it twice before. He hadn't driven 18 minutes. He had driven 3 feet, continuously looped between the boulder and the curve, burning 3/4 of a tank of diesel in 18 minutes of his life. Dean realized he wasn't driving on a road, he was driving on a treadmill. Route 62 wasn't a shortcut, it was a hungry machine. He threw the van into reverse, flooring the gas. The tires spun, but the van didn't budge. He felt the sickening, heavy resistance of the road itself, holding him in place, forcing him to remain within the loop. He tried the horn. A weak, strangled bleat emerged. He checked the fuel gauge. The needle was now trembling near the E. He pulled his emergency brake, cut the engine, and slumped back, trying to regain control. The silence in the cab was intense, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. The road wanted his fuel, and by consuming it, it consumed his time, anchoring him to this single, repetitive segment. The highway was feeding on his movement, turning kinetic energy into localized, phantom displacement. He looked out the windshield. The boulder, the curve, the trees. It was the same, unchanging scene. But now, it was subtly wrong. The colors seemed muted, the texture of the asphalt was flatter, like a poor quality photograph. He noticed the trees closest to the shoulder were not rooted in soil. Their bases were simply fading into the asphalt, like melted wax. He fumbled for his CB radio. He flipped the channel switch. Static. He tried channel 19, the truckers' main channel. A sound cut through the static, loud and piercing. It wasn't a voice. It was music. A single, repeating 8-second loop of a piano melody. A bright, tinny, deeply melancholic tune, played over and over, faster and faster, like a broken record stuck in a groove. Ting 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 ting, da dum dum dum. Dean knew that sound. It was the theme music of an old, obscure 1970s TV show, a forgotten comedy that had aired late at night when he was a child. He suddenly felt a wave of nausea, the music bringing with it an aggressive, invasive familiarity that suffocated him. He looked out the driver's side window, into the thick, lightless woods. A flicker of movement. Another vehicle. A 1980s Dodge pickup truck, its paint peeling a pale, sickly green. It was driving slowly, silently, parallel to him on the phantom side of the road, just on the other side of the faded centerline. The driver was a middle-aged man in a checkered flannel shirt and a baseball cap. His face was obscured by shadow, but Dean could see his hands on the wheel. They were skeletal, almost luminous, and they were moving exactly in sync with Dean's previous movements. As Dean had turned the wheel to take the corner 20 minutes ago, the phantom driver turned the wheel. As Dean had slammed on the brakes, the phantom driver leaned forward, mimicking the action. The ghost driver was performing Dean's own vanished time, perpetually locked in the loop he had just escaped. He was a passenger in his own, endlessly looping final moments. The ghost driver suddenly stopped mimicking. He slowed his pickup to a crawl, leaning forward, and then slowly, unnaturally, lifted his baseball cap. His eyes were not eyes. They were deep, empty pockets of blackness, like holes punched through a gray, shriveled mask of skin. And the face was one of infinite, weary resignation. He reached up, and with a terrible, slow movement, he pointed to Dean's fuel gauge. Then, he raised his other hand and pointed to Dean's temple. Dean started the transit van again, the engine catching with a rough cough. The phantom driver vanished instantly, along with his pickup, but the eerie piano music continued to accelerate on the CB radio, now sounding like a furious calliope. Ting 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 ting, da dum dum dum. The fuel gauge needle was resting firmly on E. Dean took a deep breath. He had no fuel left to burn, which meant he couldn't play the highway's game. He had to use the road, not fight it. He shifted the van into neutral, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the crushing cold of the Appalachian night. The moment his feet touched the asphalt, the eerie piano loop stopped. The silence returned, but this time, it felt like the highway was holding its breath. He walked to the front of the van and opened the hood. He knew nothing about the van's internal wiring, but he needed to disable the speedometer cable, the connection to the mechanical display, to prevent the road from registering his movement. He fumbled in the toolbox for a wrench, his hands shaking so violently he dropped the tool repeatedly. The darkness was absolute. His flashlight beams seemed too weak to be real. As he worked, a new sound emerged. A slow, heavy thump 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 that echoed from the surrounding forest. It sounded like an enormous, slow heartbeat. He located the cable housing, a thick, greasy sheath leading from the transmission. He unscrewed the bolt holding it to the sensor, his muscles screaming with effort, and yanked the cable free. He dropped the end of the cable onto the engine block. He closed the hood, slammed the door, and got back behind the wheel. The heartbeat outside was louder, closer. He started the engine. It sputtered, but ran. He eased the van into drive and, using the incline to his advantage, let the vehicle coast forward, only touching the accelerator once, gently, to maintain momentum. He watched the odometer, still frozen at 187,452. The needle did not move. He passed the boulder. He passed the curve. He passed the next familiar cluster of pine trees. And then, he saw a stretch of road that was definitively new. The asphalt was cleaner. The markings were different. He had broken the loop. He was driving on reality again, starved of the mechanical data the road needed to lock him in place. But the ordeal wasn't over. As he drove, coasting on fumes and gravity, the ghost gauge came to him. It appeared not on the dashboard, but in his mind's eye, a flickering, translucent meter, exactly matching the fuel gauge, hovering over his actual vision. It was empty. The gauge was pegged at E. He drove for another 10 minutes before the engine finally choked and died, starving of fuel. The van coasted to a stop near a dilapidated wooden bridge. He had driven 10 actual miles on an empty tank, but the total time felt like 2 hours. He looked at the odometer one last time. 187,452. It had not moved a single foot. Dean stepped out, his knees weak. The air was cold, but clear. The mountain pass was silent. He was alone. He looked back down the road, at the darkness where the boulder and the curve were, and he knew the highway had let him go. But the ghost meter remained, hovering in his sight. It didn't measure gasoline anymore. It measured time. As he walked down the road, heading toward the distant, faint lights of a town he hoped was there, he felt a crushing weight of stolen time. He had burned through 18 minutes in the loop, but the road hadn't just taken his fuel. It had taken something else. He reached for his phone to call for help. When he unlocked the screen, the date was still correct, but the call log was filled with 18 consecutive, identical messages, each time stamped 1 minute apart, sent during the period he was trapped. I am on 62. I am running low. Need help. It is 2:05 a.m. I passed the rock. Why is the rock again? My gauge is dropping. Dean. The road hadn't erased the time. It had lived it 18 times, and now the memory, the cumulative, desperate memory of those repetitive, fatal minutes, was lodged inside his head, an indelible ghost mileage marking his own personal tank. He was free, but forever exhausted by the life he had lived and lost, 18 times over, on the Ghost Gauge Highway. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.